Зараз сигнал з Росії.
Current signals from Russia are, to be honest, not good. They're trying to avoid the necessity to meet. They don't want to end this war. They're continuing their massive attacks against Ukraine and really harsh assaults on the front lines.
The top diplomat of the European Union is warning against pushing Ukraine to give up territories to Russia as part of a future peace deal. Speaking in our first UK interview since EU leaders joined Donald Trump's White House peace talks with Ukraine, Kaja Kallas told the BBC's Today program that letting Russia keep Ukrainian territories was a trap that Putin wants us to walk into. The Donbas region in eastern Ukraine has long been contested by Russia, with military aggression forcing 1.5 million Ukrainians to flee over the past decade. Ukraine has consistently rejected conceding Donbas to the Kremlin in exchange for peace, though Trump stressed the need for swapping of territories. And to discuss this in detail, we have international affairs analyst Dr. Marrick Laskiewicz, who joins us from London. Marrick, glad to have you join us. What's your sense of the warning issued by Kaja Kallas?
Well, the point is that if Ukraine, together with European support, has no intention of agreeing to Russia hold so much as a square mile of Ukrainian territory, then there really is no chance of any sort of peace treaty. That's what it boils down to. President Donald Trump has said there should be some, as he put it, swapping of territory. President Putin has made out his stall, what he wants, Donbass and so on, Crimea. And now it is quite clear the Europeans and Ukraine do not want this. And so the chances of a peace treaty are precisely zero.
Indeed, and she calls it a trap that Russia wants EU and Zelensky to work in to break this trap thing down.
Yeah, it's called trap, but there are no specifics. What is the trap precisely? There was a war. There are some Russian separatists. There is usually in this some sort of negotiation. If there is no negotiation, then the war will continue. And quite why it is a trap is unclear.
Now, for her, the strongest security guarantee is a strong Ukrainian army, and this will depend on what member states of the coalition of the willing are ready to contribute. What's your sense of this statement from Kaja Kallas?
Yeah, there are two aspects to this. Essentially, Ukraine is too weak and too poor to withstand Russia, and so money has to come from somewhere. The question is, will the coalition, the willing, essentially Europe, cough up all the funds and the military hardware? Has it got those sort of funds, and does it have that hardware? And the answer is no. Hence, the goal for the EU and NATO is to bring America in. But, as President Donald Trump has said, he's not willing to do so. He's willing to sell arms and may give, but he's very vague about this, help in the security guarantees. So from this point of view, it's as before, with Ukraine wanting more funds, essentially, and more hardware. As for the peace, there is no such thing as an eternal guarantee. And please note, in 1994, Ukraine received guarantees. They simply don't mean anything in the long run. And with Russia, especially because Poland had 19 peace treaties in its history with Russia, and Russia broke every single one. There simply is no peace guarantee that lasts. And for example, not just Russia. There were peace guarantees and so security guarantees in the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, but World War II still occurred.
And that's probably why, indeed, that what she's saying about Ukraine having its own army comes in quite, I don't know whether to say handy or makes a lot of sense. But then the feasibility of that occurring, what do you think?
Well, as things stand, it's very low. Ukraine has its own army. Ukraine is too poor in military hardware and also in funds to withstand Russia by itself. So when it says it wants an army, it really wants other people to pay for that army. That's what it boils down to, and to give it the hardware. And since only Europe is remotely willing, but possesses neither enough hardware nor enough money, then all that really remains is President Zelensky is yet again asking for more support, as he's been doing for the past 3.5 years, which is precisely what President Donald Trump had objections towards.
As far as Kalas is concerned, Putin got everything he wanted in the Alaska meeting with no concessions made, no sanctions. And this is encouraging him, she says, against negotiating for peace while the killing goes on. In fact, there were latest strikes in Ukraine. This has been echoed by people like Bolton, who the FBI president, went to his house to do some searching. He also talked about this, What do you make of that?
Well, indeed, the Alaskan negotiation have been heavily criticized, but they seem to miss the point. It is an opening part of the negotiations. In principle, Putin did make some minor concessions, which are minor, but they're a start. Ukraine and Europe making no concessions at all. Well, there's no negotiation then. If there's no negotiation, then there will never be a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin, which indeed the Kremlin signaling is pointless, and indeed it is pointless as things stand. The driver for peace is President Donald Trump. His views, however, are not accepted by Ukraine and Europe, and therefore his drive towards any sort of settlement will, on the face of it, not occur. But it is repeated that the Alaska meeting was simply a start. These are negotiations. This has happened for the past 6,000 years. No negotiations are carried out just in one go. And it was up to now Ukraine and Europe to see what to make of them.
Zelensky wants to have an understanding of the security guarantees architecture within 7 to 10 days.
Well, he can want what he likes. The fact of the matter is he's made a request, and whether Europe is able in 7 to 10 days. Please remember, Europe is not a homogeneous entity. It consists of many member states with their own viewpoints, of which England and France are very important, of course, and there's Germany in Europe. And there's, of course, the neighbors like Romania and Poland. For them all to work out a security guarantee is already troublesome. And now add to it that President Donald Trump is very vague and, as far as I can see, has no intention of committing any American troops. He might commit what? A vague statement along the lines of Clause 5 in NATO, which incidentally is by no means a binding clause in the sense it has an opt-out in it, so that nothing actually has to be done by NATO forces if a NATO member is attacked. And so therefore, President Zelensky, as he's been doing for the last 3.5 years, is issuing a set of demands which, on the face of it, are likely to be met because no one is ready to work out those sort of guarantees, especially not President Donald Trump, on whom these guarantees will ultimately depend.
Do you agree that Russia is acting as if there are no negotiations going on?
Well, this is a very important point to underline. Strictly speaking, legally, there are no concrete proposals apart from what Russia has suggested on the table, apart from the old proposals whereby Russia must disgorge everything it's taken from 2014, or if you look at the Russian side, it was previously wanted the whole of Ukraine. And therefore, whilst this is going on and no ceasefire has been agreed, the war will continue. So the notion, and this is a point that President Zelensky keeps making, and of course the Europeans, that Russia keeps fighting. It keeps fighting because there is no agreed ceasefire. And there will be no agreed ceasefire because Russia does not want a ceasefire. It wants a peace treaty on its terms. And so therefore, all it boils down to is all we had really for 3.5 years from the side of Ukraine and Europe, which is outrage, constant talk. But at the end of the day, needs now concrete action.
Really? Russia is ruling out any meeting between President Vladimir Putin and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, accusing Ukraine of neglecting all conditions of peace. This is coming from the foreign minister Lavrov. Who should be accusing who of rejecting conditions or setting conditions?
Yeah, the thing here is to remember you're up against Russia. Russia's been playing this diplomatic game for years, decades, arguably centuries. And the point is, they're an old hand. In the old days, and to this day still exist, you accuse some Russian diplomats or trade delegation of being spies, you throw out 15 of them, say, and another 15 Westerners are expelled from Russia in a tit-for-tat. Russia is accused of this, and Russia replies back, there's not us, it's the others. This is just meaningless hot air, which in a sense actually benefits Russia twofold. Not only does it give a reply, of course, but the key point is it's hot air whilst Russia is advancing. It's, if you like, in that sense, playing for time. The accusation by the Russians, very seldom are the accusations actually anything more than simply diplomatic chess play.
Now, listen to what Macron, the president of France, said about Russia. He says, Putin behaves like a predator, a cannibal, who continues to feed for the sake of his survival.
Yeah, I think in some cases that is right. After all, President Putin is a dictator, and there's a Chinese proverb, he who rides a tiger can never step off, and that's President Putin's point. He can't simply, as it put it, lose. A dictator who loses won't be in power in the next 24 hours. Moreover, there's no obvious reason why he should lose. His predator activity is actually benefiting him. And the key point here to remember is something that President Putin said right at the start of his reign, because it is a reign in effect, is that Russia will never be liked but can be respected. So now when President Macron calls him a predator and Russia all these words, actually it's music to the ears because it shows Russia is serious. Please remember, under President Yeltsin, Russia was written off. It was a sort of upper volta with nukes, as one American Secretary of State called it. It was kind of a has-been nation. And suddenly, for years now, Russia is top billing. Russia is there. Russia meets America in a summit, just like the old days. And all that, and including, of course, these speeches by Macron or anyone else, all this is music to Putin's ears and those Russians who support him. Because please remember, although it is said and gives the impression that President Putin alone is fighting this war, this is not true. Many Russians support it, and not just Russians, please remember. There are other nations who want a, quote, multipolar world is the term. And when the Russians are winning, they're one step closer to knocking America off its perch as the most powerful nation and this Eurocentric world together with it.
Now, there is talk that Russia, Putin particularly, doesn't even want Ukraine to exist as a nation and doesn't even accept the presidency of Vladimir Zelensky.
Both points are absolutely correct. In Russian eyes, Ukraine is a part of Russia. It's part of the original Rus. And one of the television interviews which he gave on American television, he went all the way back to Rurik, to the founding of Kiev and Rus, which in Russian eyes is the founding part of Russia. And therefore, yes, he sees the Ukrainians as a type of Russian. That's incidentally why he's not going to use any nuclear arms in Ukraine and hasn't used any. You don't nuke your own. On the other hand, when eventually attacks Poland, as I stated in my books, there will be a nuclear war because Poland has made it quite clear it's not a part of Russia. And that has been accepted by the Russians. Secondly, yes, there is a point. What the Ukrainian constitution bans are elections during the time of war. But, says President Putin, what kind of democracy is that? And therefore, what he is saying is President Zelensky has no popular mandate for his actions. And this is a further problem to the bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin. Putin will point to elections held, which he won. Now, of course, we know those elections aren't anything like democratic elections because, for example, one of the chief counter-candidates, Navalny, was in effect murdered. I mean, let's not beat around the bush. But that's not the point. The point is Putin has an apparent mandate and Zelensky is living off elections many years ago. So in both cases that you've stated, that is indeed President Putin and many Russian viewpoints as well.
Why should Putin be concerned about the election of another country? I mean, the same can be said of what Trump is doing in Brazil. Why should he be concerned about what's his name, the former president that is being tried? And does Trump really understand this Putin's thinking when he's doing all this? Does he really understand the weight of how Putin is thinking?
To answer your first question, there are stronger nations and weaker nations, and since time immemorial, the stronger nations have either conquered or exercised hegemonistic power in the sense of interfering in other nations. Africa is, of course, an excellent example of how the West, even when it's no longer, this Western Europe to be exact, no longer has empires, it still interferes in elections, still has a view on who should and should not be ruling the country. And so when Trump is doing that in Brazil, it's because the Monroe Doctrine, going back to the 19th century, essentially said the whole of both Americas are United States' backyard, which of course for Latin Americans is scarcely palatable. But that is how USA operates. To come to your second question, no, President Trump does not fully understand President Putin because President Donald Trump is a businessman who is a politician, whereas President Putin is a politician who uses business as a tool for political advancement of his scheme. And therefore, President Donald Trump doesn't fully, and that's why he has these moments when he said, is just President Putin tapping me along? And then he meets President Putin. President Putin has indeed concrete terms for a peace. And so President Donald Trump is somewhat out of his depth. But please remember, when dealing with Russia, it is very difficult. And you can make out a case that President Roosevelt didn't fully understand Russia either, and so on. They are a hard nation to grasp. Winston Churchill, and then the Prime Minister of Great Britain, had once stated a key point about Russia. He said, I cannot predict their next move. It's an enigma wrapped in a puzzle. Although I personally don't think that's true, it just shows you how difficult understanding Russia is. So that President Donald Trump doesn't understand it. He's in good company.
Oh, well, we watch and see what plays out, what happens in the international political circles. Thank you so much, Dr. Marrick Laskiewicz there, for being on The World.